The air in the Redemption Gulch saloon was thick enough to chew a foul stew of stale beer sweat and despair. At the center of it all, a woman stood on a makeshift stage, her eyes as empty as a pauper's pockets. She was chattel, a piece of property to be sold. Men hollered their bids, a chorus of casual cruelty. Then a voice, quiet but firm, cut through the noise. $1. The bid came from a man in the corner, a rancher, whose face was a road map of loneliness and grief. When he won her, she looked at him, her spirit broken, and whispered the 7 words that would forever haunt him. Please. Just make it quick. He paid the silver $1, and then he did the unthinkable. This isn't just a story of the West. It's the true account of how a single $1 and an act of impossible kindness changed everything. The year was 1888. The town of Redemption, Gulch, Arizona, was a wound on the face of the desert, festering under a sun that offered no mercy. It was a place where hope came to die, and fortunes, both real and imagined, were built on the bones of the desperate. The heart of this festering wound was the Gilded Cage, a saloon owned by a man with the disposition of a vulture and the name to match Samuel Pike. On this particular Tuesday, Pike was hosting an event he called a misfortune auction. It was his cruel theater, a spectacle where the debts of the town's most broken souls were settled in the most public and humiliating way possible. Tonight, the lot was a young woman. Her name was Rose Dunn. She stood on a small, rickety stage made of beer crates, a single lantern illuminating the grime on her cheek and the profound exhaustion in her dark eyes. She wasn't defiant. Defiance required a spark of hope, and hers had been extinguished months ago. Her dress, once a respectable calico, was torn and stained. She stared at a spot on the far wall, a water stain shaped like a weeping angel, and retreated into the numb, silent fortress of her mind. The crowd was a pack of mangy dogs, drifters, miners with more dust in their pockets than gold and ranch hands, looking for a cheap thrill. "All right, you hyenas, settle down," Pike shouted, his voice slick with greed. "What we have here is a prime piece, formerly of the Dunn Ranch before old man Dunn had the good sense to drink himself into an early grave. She's quiet, she's trainable." He smirked, letting the vile implication hang in the air. "Who'll start the bidding? Let's say $20 for this desert flower." A grimy prospector yelled, "10. I'll give you 12, shouted a burly man with a blacksmith's apron. The bids were slow, cruel, punctuated by lewd suggestions. Rose didn't flinch. She was a statue, carved from sorrow. In the darkest corner of the saloon, away from the boisterous crowd, sat Arthur Corrigan. Arthur was a man who seemed to blend in with the shadows. He was not old, perhaps 40, but the lines on his face told a story of 100 hard years. His hands, resting on the table, were calloused and scarred from rope and leather, and the unforgiving work of running his ranch, Whispering Creek, alone. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held a permanent sadness, a quiet grief that kept him at a distance from the world. He came to town only when necessity demanded it for supplies, and he always left as quickly as he could. He had been nursing a single whiskey for an hour, the noise of the saloon a dull roar in his ears. He wasn't there for the auction. He was simply waiting for the mercantile to open at dawn. But Pike's repulsive spectacle had snagged his attention. He watched Rose Dunn, and he didn't see a desert flower or a piece of property. He saw the ghost of every hope he had ever lost. He saw the same brittle emptiness that greeted him in his shaving mirror each morning. 1650. The bidding stalled. These were not wealthy men, and their cruelty had its price limit. Pike was getting impatient. "Come on, you cheapskates. This is a bargain." Arthur Corrigan pushed his chair back. The sound scraped across the floorboards, drawing a few eyes. He didn't stand. He just sat there, his gaze fixed on Rose. The room seemed to hold its breath for a second. $1, Arthur said. The voice was not loud, but it had the quality of rock. It was low, steady, and utterly devoid of emotion. It cut through the drunken chatter like a razor. The saloon went quiet. Men turned to look at the solitary rancher in the corner. Pike's greasy smile faltered. He squinted, trying to understand the angle. $1. Pike scoffed. Is that a joke, Corrigan? The bid is at $16.50? Arthur didn't move a muscle. He simply looked at Pike, his blue eyes as cold as a winter creek. That wasn't a bid. That was an insult. To the girl. My bid is $1. A murmur went through the crowd. This was not part of the usual script. Was Corrigan mocking Pike, or was he mad? The blacksmith, the current high bidder, grunted. Let him have her for $1. She ain't worth more than that look on her face anyway. He was embarrassed, his cheap lust exposed by Arthur's strange, solemn dignity. The other bidders shuffled their feet and looked away. The sport was ruined. Pike was furious. He was being made a fool of. But he also knew Arthur Corrigan. Corrigan was quiet, but he was not a man to be trifled with. There were stories about him from before he'd settled at Whispering Creek, whispers of a past that involved a gun and a quicker draw than most. More importantly, every man in that room knew Corrigan was a man of his word. If he said $1, he meant $1. To push him would be to invite trouble that Pike, for all his bluster, didn't want. Fine Pike spat his face red with anger. Sold to the lonely man with the lonely $1. He slammed a makeshift gavel on the bar. She's yours, Corrigan. Get her out of my sight. Arthur stood. He was taller than he looked, sitting down, broad-shouldered, but lean, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of years of hard labor. He walked to the bar, pulled a single worn silver dollar from his vest pocket, and placed it on the sticky wood. The coin seemed to absorb all the light in the room. It was a stark, final payment. He didn't look at Pike. He turned and walked towards the stage. The crowd parted for him. Rose finally broke her stare from the water stain on the wall. She looked at the man approaching her. She saw the weathered face, the sad eyes, the complete lack of malice or lust she had expected. What she saw instead was a profound, unnerving emptiness, a sorrow that mirrored her own. It was in its own way even more terrifying. A cruel man she could understand. A man with no feeling at all was an abyss. He stopped in front of her. He didn't reach for her. He just waited. Her lips trembled. All the fight she had left, all the will to survive, had been ground down to a single desperate plea for mercy. She thought she knew what came next. She had been sold for the price of a cheap drink. She was his property now to be used and discarded. She just wanted the inevitable to be over. She leaned forward, her voice, a fragile, hoarse whisper, barely audible over the ringing in her ears. "Please." She breathed the words catching in her throat. "Just make it quick." Arthur Corrigan's expression didn't change. The sadness in his eyes deepened, a flicker of some ancient pain surfacing for a moment before being suppressed. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He turned and walked towards the door. After a few steps he stopped and looked back, not at her, but at the space beside him. It was a silent command. "Follow." For a moment, Rose remained frozen. Then some instinct for survival, however faint, took over. She stepped down from the crates, her legs unsteady. She followed the silent man out of the gilded cage, away from the jeers and the stench and the life she had known. She walked out into the cold desert night, following a man who had paid $1 for her, convinced she was walking towards her end. The truth, however, was something neither of them could have ever imagined. The journey to Whispering Creek Ranch was made in absolute silence. Arthur led a sturdy-looking horse from the livery, saddled it, and mounted without a word. He gestured for Rose to take his hand. She flinched, expecting a rough grip of violation. Instead, his hand was firm but impersonal, helping her up to sit behind him on the saddle. She sat stiffly, her hands clutching the back of the saddle horn, careful not to touch him. They rode out of the dim lights of Redemption Gulch and into the vast, ink-black expanse of the desert. The moon was a silver sliver, offering little comfort. Every hoofbeat on the dusty trail sounded like a tick of a clock, counting down to the moment her plea would be answered. Her mind raced with terrifying possibilities. Would he take her into the wilderness and leave her there? Would the ranch be a filthy hovel where he would... She couldn't complete the thought. She focused on the steady rhythm of the horse, the cool night air on her face, and the rigid set of the man's back in front of her. After what felt like an eternity, the landscape began to change. The flat, scrubby desert gave way to rolling hills dotted with juniper and pine. They followed a narrow, winding creek, its gentle gurgling the first peaceful sound Rose had heard in months. Finally, a silhouette appeared against the slightly less black sky of early dawn. A ranch house, a large barn, and a series of corrals. This was not the ramshackle hut of a degenerate she had pictured. The fences were mended, the corrals were clean. The house itself was a simple but solid log and stone structure with a wide porch and glass in the windows. A soft yellow light glowed from one of them. As they dismounted, the front door opened. An older man, his face a leathery tan, and his hair a thick braid of grey, stepped out onto the porch. He held a rifle loosely in one hand and a lantern in the other. He looked from Arthur to Rose, his dark eyes sharp and questioning. Arthur the man asked, his voice low and cautious. "It's all right," Hector Arthur said. It was the first time Rose had heard him speak more than a single sentence. His voice was gravelly, but not unkind. "Put the rifle away. This is Miss Dunn. She will be staying with us." Hector's eyes narrowed slightly, taking in Rose's dishevelled appearance. He clearly had questions, but he simply nodded, his face unreadable. He gave Rose a long, assessing look before turning and going back inside. Arthur led Rose onto the porch. He didn't push her or guide her. He just opened the door and stood aside. Hesitantly, she stepped over the threshold. The inside of the house was another shock. It was Spartan, but impeccably clean. A fire crackled in a large stone fireplace, casting a warm glow over simple, well-made wooden furniture. Books lined a shelf on one wall. There was a faint scent of wood smoke leather and something else. Lavender. It was a house that was cared for a home. But it felt empty, as if its heart had been removed. Arthur walked past her to a door down a short hallway. He opened it. "This will be your room," he said, his voice as flat as before. Rose tensed her whole body, preparing for the inevitable. This was it. He pushed the door fully open, revealing a small, simple room. It contained a narrow bed with a handmade quilt, a small wooden dresser, and a washstand with a pitcher and bowl. The window looked out towards the rising sun. It was, without a doubt, the cleanest, safest-looking room she had seen in over a year. Arthur reached into his pocket and produced a small iron key. He held it out to her. "This is your room." He repeated, his gaze, not on her, but on the key in his hand. "Lock it if you wish. No one will enter without your permission." "Not even me." Rose stared at the key, then at his face. She couldn't comprehend it. This was not the act of a man who had bought a woman for $1. This was something else entirely. Something so far outside her realm of experience that she couldn't process it. I don't understand. She whispered the words trembling. He finally met her eyes, and for the first time she saw past the emptiness to the profound, aching sorrow beneath. There's stew on the stove. Hector made it. There are clean clothes in the dresser. They belonged to my wife. They should fit well enough. Eat. Rest. The door has a lock. He placed the key on the dresser, turned without another word, and left, closing the door softly behind him. Rose stood frozen in the middle of the room, listening to his footsteps recede down the hall. Then she heard the front door open and close. He had gone outside. She stumbled to the door and pressed the small cold iron key into the lock. It turned with a solid, satisfying click. She leaned her forehead against the rough wood of the door, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she wept. They were not tears of terror or despair, but of utter, soul-shaking confusion. She did as he said. She found a simple nightgown in the dresser, neatly folded and smelling faintly of lavender. She washed her face and hands in the cool water from the pitcher. She crept into the main room and found the pot of stew on the stove. It was thick with beef and vegetables, and she ate it so fast she barely tasted it, her hunger a physical pain. After she ate, she returned to her room, locked the door again, and crawled into the bed. The sheets were cool and clean. The quilt was heavy. For the first time in months, she was not cold. For the first time in months, a door was locked against the world. But the man who had given her the key was on the other side, and he was a complete and terrifying mystery. The unthinkable had happened. He had brought her to his isolated home, and offered her sanctuary. Why? What did he want from her? The question echoed in the silent, safe room, more frightening than any threat could have been. The days that followed unfolded in a strange, silent rhythm. Rose woke each morning to the sounds of the ranch coming to life, the distant lowing of cattle, the clang of a hammer on the anvil in the barn, the quiet murmur of Arthur and Hector's voices outside. She would emerge from her room to find coffee brewing on the stove and bread or biscuits on the table. Arthur treated her with a profound and unnerving respect. He never looked at her for too long. He spoke to her only when necessary, asking simple questions like, "Are you warm enough? Or is there anything you need?" He never ever mentioned the saloon, the auction, or the dollar he had paid for her. It was a ghost that lived between them, a subject so terrible it couldn't be given the breath of life. Hector, the old ranch hand, was a different kind of quiet. His was an observant silence. He watched Rose with his sharp, dark eyes, his expression revealing nothing. He saw how she flinched at sudden movements, how she ate as if her plate might be snatched away at any moment, and how she scrubbed the floors and washed the dishes with a frantic energy, as if trying to work off a debt she couldn't comprehend. One afternoon, about a week after her arrival, Rose was dusting the main room. She ran her cloth over the bookshelf, her fingers tracing the leather-bound spines. Most were books on agriculture and animal husbandry, but one was different. It was a slim volume of poetry by a woman named Christina Rossetti. She pulled it from the shelf. The cover was worn smooth from handling. She opened it, but the words were just black squiggles on the page. Her father had always intended to teach her to read properly, but life and then death had gotten in the way. She was so engrossed in the shapes of the letters that she didn't hear Arthur enter the house. That was my wife's favorite. His voice, though quiet, startled her so badly she dropped the book. It landed on the floor with a soft thud. "I'm sorry," she gasped, scrambling to pick it up. "I didn't mean to. I was just looking." "It's all right," he said, stopping a few feet away. He looked at the book in her hands, and a shadow passed over his face, a flicker of pain so deep it was almost physical. Her name was Maeve. She loved to read. Rose clutched the book to her chest. She must have been very educated. She was a teacher back east, Arthur said, his gaze distant. Before she came out here with me, she believed a book could be a key to unlock a person's mind. He looked at Rose, then truly looked at her. He saw the way she held the book, the hunger in her eyes, as she stared at the incomprehensible text. He saw the intelligence that had been starved and buried under layers of fear and abuse. "You want to know what they say, don't you?" he asked gently. She could only nod her throat tight. He gestured to the table. "Sit down." Hesitantly she did. He pulled up a chair opposite her and took the book. He opened it to the first page. "This is the letter A," he said, pointing. His large, calloused finger, a finger that knew the feel of a branding iron, and a gun looked strangely delicate as it rested on the page. "It makes the sound ah, like in Arthur." And so began the second unthinkable act. Every evening, after the grueling work of the ranch was done, after Hector had retired to his small bunkhouse, Arthur Corrigan would sit with Rose Dunn at the kitchen table. By the light of a kerosene lamp, surrounded by the ghosts of his past and the fears of hers, he taught her to read. He was a patient teacher. He started with the alphabet, then simple words, CATDOGSUNRUN. He taught her to write her own name, guiding her hand as she shakily formed the letters ROSE. When she could do that, a small, fragile smile touched her lips for the first time, a flower blooming in a wasteland. Through these lessons, the silence between them began to fill with words, and through words, understanding began to dawn. She learned about his life, not from direct stories, but from the periphery. She learned that he and Maeve had come west with dreams of building a life, a dynasty. She learned they had a son, a small boy named Thomas. And she learned through a pained, halting story one evening that he had lost them both in the same winter to a cholera outbreak that swept through the territory. "I was away on a cattle drive," he said, his voice thick with a grief that time had not healed. "By the time I got the news and rode back, it was too late. I buried them myself. Right up on that hill." He nodded towards the window, under the 2 tall pines. Rose finally understood the crushing emptiness in him. He wasn't just a lonely man. He was a haunted one. He was living in a mausoleum of his own, making a house filled with the memory of a life that had been stolen from him. And he in turn began to learn her story. As she learned to read and write, her confidence grew. She began to speak more, her voice losing its timid, whispery quality. She told him about her father, a proud man who had built a small but successful ranch from nothing. She told him about their land, the green pastures of the Dunn homestead, and the clear running water of the Verde Creek. And she told him about Bartholomew Thorne. "He's a sickness," she said one night, her eyes flashing with a fire Arthur had never seen before. "He came to the territory with money and lawyers. He wanted our water. The Verde Creek ran right through our land, and his vast ranges were dry. My father wouldn't sell. She explained how Thorne had used his power. He'd bribed land office officials to dispute her father's claims. He'd hired men to rustle their cattle and poison their wells. He'd bled her father dry with legal fees and endless court battles in a town where the judge was on his payroll. My father wasn't a weak man," Rose said, her voice shaking with anger and sorrow. "But Thorne broke him. He broke his spirit. He started drinking, and one day his heart just gave out. Thorne's men were there the next day with a foreclosure notice. They threw me out with nothing but the clothes on my back. Destitute and alone, she had made her way to Redemption Gulch, hoping to find work as a seamstress or a laundress. But a single woman with no family and no money was easy prey. Samuel Pike had offered her a job cleaning the saloon, which soon became a debt she could never repay, trapping her until she ended up on that stage. Arthur listened, his face like granite. He now understood that her scars, like his, were not just on the surface. They were carved into her soul by loss and injustice. As the weeks turned into months, Rose blossomed. She was no longer the broken creature from the saloon. She was intelligent, quick-witted, and had a strength she was only just beginning to realize. She worked alongside Arthur and Hector, not as a drudge, but as a partner. She learned to mend fences, tend the small vegetable garden Maeve had planted, and even ride a horse on her own. The lavender scent in the house was no longer just a memory of Maeve. It was Rose tending the small bushes that grew by the porch. Whispering Creek Ranch was no longer just a place of grief. The silence was now comfortable, punctuated by conversation, and on rare occasions, quiet laughter. A fragile, tentative affection grew between Arthur and Rose. It was not a fiery passion, but a slow, gentle healing, a grafting of two broken branches onto the same tree. But the world outside the sanctuary of the ranch had not forgotten them. The shadow of Bartholomew Thorne was long, and it was about to fall upon Whispering Creek. Bartholomew Thorne was a man who considered Redemption, Gulch, and the surrounding territory his personal fiefdom. He was a large man, both in girth and in presence, always dressed in expensive Eastern suits that looked comical and out of place in the dusty town. His face was perpetually flushed, and his small, piggish eyes missed nothing, especially when it came to business. And everything to Thorne was business. He had heard the gossip, of course, about how the reclusive rancher Arthur Corrigan had bought Pike's girl for $1. He'd dismissed it as the strange whim of a lonely man. But then he began to see them. Once a month, Arthur and Rose would ride into town for supplies. Thorne first saw them from the window of the assayer's office. He didn't recognize Rose at first. The woman on the horse next to Corrigan was not the gaunt, broken thing he'd last seen being evicted from her family home. This woman sat tall in the saddle. Her hair was clean and neatly braided, her face had color, and her eyes, when she looked at Corrigan, were clear and alive. Thorne was not a man who believed in redemption. He believed in leverage. He began to ask questions. He leaned on Samuel Pike, who was more than happy to grovel. He spoke to the sheriff, a man named Brody, whose salary was supplemented generously by Thorne's civic contributions. The story became clearer. Corrigan had not used the girl. He had sheltered her. He was protecting her. And then one of Thorne's men, a hired gun named Finch, with a memory for faces, made the connection. Boss Finch said spitting tobacco juice near Thorne's polished boots. That girl with Corrigan. I seen her before. That's the Dunn girl, the one whose old man we ran off his land. Thorne's mind, always calculating, began to spin. The Dunn girl, a loose end, a complication, but also potentially an opportunity. Whispering Creek Corrigan's ranch was modest, but it had one thing Thorne coveted. Its water source was reliable, fed by a deep spring that never ran dry, unlike the seasonal Verde Creek he had fought so hard to control. He had made offers to Corrigan in the past, all of which had been quietly but firmly refused. Now he had leverage. The trouble started subtly. A section of fence on the north pasture was cut one night, and a dozen head of cattle wandered off into the hills. It took Arthur and Hector 2 days to round them up. A week later, a sack of feed grain was slashed open in the barn, a winter's supply ruined. Arthur knew it wasn't random. He saw the tracks of shod horses that did not belong to him. He knew who was behind it. "It's Thorne," he said to Rose one evening, his voice tight with controlled anger. "He's testing me, pushing." "What does he want?" Rose asked, though she already knew the answer. "The same thing he always wants," Arthur replied. "Everything that isn't his." He looked at her, his expression grim. "He knows who you are. This isn't just about my land anymore. It's about you." Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in Rose's stomach. But it was different now. It was mixed with a hot, righteous anger. This man had taken her family, her home, her name. She would not let him take this too, this sanctuary, this life she was so carefully, painstakingly rebuilding. "He thinks we're weak," she said, her voice steady. "He thinks you're just a sad, lonely man, and I'm just a broken girl he can sweep aside." "Are we?" Arthur asked, his eyes searching hers. "No," she said, the word coming out with a strength that surprised them both. "We are not." That night Rose could not sleep. She paced her small room, the lessons Arthur had taught her churning in her mind. Words were keys, he had said, keys to unlock a mind. Could they also be keys to unlock the past? Her father? He was a meticulous man. He had railed against Thorne's corruption, not just the bullying but the illegalities of it. The forged documents, the bribes. He had always said, "The truth is in the ink, Rosie. You just have to know where to look." An image flashed in her mind. Her father late at night in his small office. He wasn't just writing letters. He was making entries in a thick leather-bound book, a ledger. He had always kept a detailed ledger for the ranch finances. But this one was different. It was hidden. She remembered seeing him slide it into a cunningly built secret compartment in the base of the heavy oak desk he had built himself. She shot out of her room and found Arthur, sitting by the cold fireplace, staring into the embers, a rifle across his lap. "Arthur," she said, her voice breathless with excitement and fear. "My father." He kept a ledger. A second one. It wasn't just about our ranch. It was about Thorne. He wrote everything down. The bribes he knew about, the names of the men Thorne paid, the discrepancies in the land office claims. He said it was his insurance. Arthur looked up, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "A ledger. Where is it?" "It's at my old home," she said. "In his desk. I think I know exactly where he hid it." A slow, dangerous light dawned in Arthur's eyes. This was no longer a matter of defense, of mending fences and guarding cattle. She had just handed him a weapon. The ledger was proof. It was the one thing that could bring Bartholomew Thorne down, not with a bullet, but with the law, or at least a version of it, that even a corrupt town couldn't ignore if the evidence was strong enough. "Thorne's men are using the old ranch house as an outpost." Arthur said, his mind already working. "It's occupied." "I know," Rose replied, her chin held high. "But that desk is my father's. That ledger is my inheritance. And we are going to get it back." He looked at her, at the fierce determination that had replaced the fear in her eyes. The woman he had bought for $1 was now offering him a path to a justice he hadn't thought possible. He had saved her from the gilded cage, and now she was offering to save them both from the shadow of Bartholomew Thorne. The plan was audacious, born of desperation and a shared, steely resolve. Arthur, Rose, and Hector spent the next 2 days meticulously preparing. They studied a hand-drawn map Rose made from memory, marking the layout of her old homestead, the position of the main house, the bunkhouse, and the barn. Thorne kept a crew of 4 men there, led by the sneering gunman, Finch. Getting in and out unseen would require a combination of stealth timing and sheer nerve. Their chance came on the third night under the sliver of a new moon. The darkness was their cloak. They rode not their usual horses, but two of the quietest ponies from the herd, their hooves muffled with rags. Arthur carried his trusted Winchester rifle, Hector a shotgun, and Rose, to her own surprise, a small pistol Arthur had insisted she learn to use. "I hope you never need it," he'd said, his voice grim. But hope is not a strategy. They left their ponies in a thicket of mesquite, a half-mile from the homestead, and approached on foot, moving like ghosts through the familiar landscape of Rose's childhood. Every rock, every gully was a memory. The air, which should have smelled of home, was tainted with the smell of stale whiskey and Thorne's arrogance. Light spilled from the windows of the main house. Through the grimy glass they could see Finch and two of his men playing cards at the dining table, her dining table. The fourth man was a sentry, slowly pacing the perimeter of the yard. Hector Arthur whispered, "You take the sentry." Quietly. "We need the surprise." The old man nodded his face, impassive, as he melted into the deeper shadows near the barn. Arthur and Rose crept towards the back of the house, to the small window of her father's office. It was dark. The desk, a hulking shadow, was visible against the far wall. A low whistle, the call of a nightjar, echoed from the barn. It was Hector's signal. The sentry was down. Now Arthur breathed. He worked quickly, using a long knife to pry the window latch. It opened with a faint groan. The space was small, but Rose was slender. Arthur helped her climb through her feet, landing silently on the dusty floorboards. The room smelled of disuse and mice, but underneath it all she could still smell the faint, comforting scent of her father's pipe tobacco and old paper. She moved with a sureness born of memory, her hands finding the massive oak desk in the darkness. Her fingers trembled as they slid along the baseboard, searching for the nearly invisible seam. She found it. Pressing a specific knot in the wood, she heard a soft click. A small panel, no bigger than her hand, sprang open. Her heart leapt. She reached inside her fingers, brushing against cool, worn leather. She had it. She pulled the ledger free, clutching it to her chest like a sacred text. It was then that everything went wrong. A floorboard creaked under Arthur's weight as he kept watch at the window. Inside the main room, the card game stopped. "What was that?" Finch's voice was sharp. "Probably just a rat," another man slurred. "Rats don't wear boots," Finch snarled. He kicked his chair back and stood drawing his Colt. "Check the back rooms," Arthur's whispered word was urgent. Rose out now. But it was too late. The office door burst open, silhouetting one of Thorne's men. He saw Rose, the open window, the ledger in her hands. His eyes went wide. He opened his mouth to shout. Arthur didn't hesitate. The Winchester cracked the sound, deafening in the enclosed space. The man fell backward with a heavy thud. The house exploded into chaos. "We're hit! It's an ambush!" Finch roared. Gunshots shattered the night. Wood splintered from the doorframe as bullets ripped through it. "Go," Arthur yelled, pushing Rose toward the window as he laid down covering fire. She scrambled out into the night, the ledger tucked securely inside her shirt. Hector opened up with his shotgun from the barn, the booming blasts providing a crucial distraction. One of the men who ran out the front door screamed and fell. Arthur climbed out the window and joined Rose, pulling her into a run towards the barn. Bullets whizzed past their ears. They dove behind a water trough, just as Finch appeared on the porch, firing wildly into the darkness. "It's Corrigan," he screamed. And the girl, "Don't let them get away." Suddenly the sound of approaching horses thundered from the direction of town. A posse. Thorne must have anticipated something, or his man in town had sent for them. They were trapped. Leading the posse was Sheriff Brody, his face illuminated by the lanterns of his deputies. Alongside him, On a fine black stallion was Bartholomew Thorne himself, a look of smug triumph on his face. "Give it up, Corrigan," Brodie yelled, his voice strained. "You're surrounded. He's a killer, Sheriff," Thorne bellowed. "He and that little tramp broke into my property and murdered my man." "You're a witness." Arthur Hector and Rose were pinned down, outnumbered and outgunned. Despair, cold and absolute, began to set in. It was then that Rose did something no one expected. She stood up. "Rose, get down," Arthur yelled, reaching for her. She ignored him. She held the ledger high in the air, her voice ringing out in the night, clear and strong, filled with the fire of a righteous fury. "This isn't about his property, Sheriff Brodie. It's about my father's. It's about the Dunn Ranch, which this man Bartholomew Thorne stole." Thorne laughed, a deep, ugly sound. "The ravings of a mad woman. She has no proof, don't I?" Rose shouted back, her voice unwavering. "I have my father's ledger, a full account of every bribe you paid, Bartholomew. Every official you own, every law you broke to steal our land. It's all in here. I can read you, see, I can read every last word of your treachery." Sheriff Brodie hesitated. He had been on Thorne's payroll for years, turning a blind eye, swallowing his conscience. But he had known Rose's father. He had seen what Thorne had done to the man. And now, seeing Rose no longer a broken victim, but a fiery accuser, something inside him shifted. He looked at Thorne's sneering face, then at Arthur Corrigan's grim determination, and finally at the ledger held aloft like a torch. "Let me see the book," Brodie said, his voice low. "Don't be a fool," Brodie Thorne hissed. "Shoot them," but Brodie didn't move. He was looking at Rose, and in her eyes he saw the truth he had been avoiding for years. Finch, seeing his boss's authority challenged, made his move. "If you won't, I will." He raised his pistol, taking aim directly at Rose. The shot that rang out didn't come from Finch's gun. It came from Sheriff Brodie's. Finch crumpled to the ground, his pistol clattering on the porch steps. Thorne stared at Brodie in stunned disbelief. You shot him. You're finished, Brodie. I own you." "Not anymore," Brodie said, his voice filled with a weariness that went bone deep. He turned his pistol towards Thorne. "Get off the horse." Slowly, the confrontation was over. Thorne, stripped of his power, was just a fat, frightened man in a fancy suit. His hired guns, seeing their leader captured and Finch down, threw down their weapons. Arthur and Hector emerged from behind the trough, their weapons still ready. Rose walked forward, never taking her eyes off Thorne, and handed the ledger to Sheriff Brodie. He opened it, and by the light of a deputy's lantern, he began to read. The town's dark secrets, written in a dead man's hand, were finally brought to light. The reckoning had come not in a blaze of glory, but in the quiet, undeniable truth of ink on paper. The ride back to Redemption Gulch was a slow, surreal procession under a sky bleeding from black to bruised purple. Bartholomew Thorne, bound at the wrists, sat sullenly on his horse, his expensive suit rumpled and stained with the grime of his own downfall. His face, usually flushed with power and arrogance, was pale and slack. He was a king dethroned, and the silence from the men who rode around him was his new suffocating kingdom. Sheriff Brodie rode at the front, his back straight, his face etched with the gravity of his choice. He had crossed a line from which there was no return, and in doing so, had found a piece of his own soul he thought long lost. Arthur and Rose rode side by side, the exhausted quiet between them, a stark contrast to the thundering violence of the night. Rose clutched the reins, the leather cool and solid in her hands, a tether to this new, unbelievable reality. Beside her, Arthur was a vigilant shadow, his Winchester resting across his saddle, his eyes scanning the pre-dawn gloom, ensuring their victory was not stolen from them at the last moment. As they entered the single dusty street of the town, doors creaked open. Faces, timid and fearful, peered from behind curtains. They saw Thorne a prisoner. They saw Sheriff Brodie transformed. And they saw Arthur Corrigan and the Dunn girl riding not as captive and captor, but as allies. A current of silent electric shock passed through the town. The sun was rising, and it seemed to be rising on a different world. The arrival of Federal Marshal Elias Trent, 3 days later, sealed Thorne's fate. Trent was a tall, lean man, with eyes the color of faded denim and a demeanor that suggested he had no time for fools or liars. He set up in the sheriff's office, and his first order of business was to interview Rose Dunn. Arthur drove her into town in the wagon. He waited on the bench outside the office, carving a small piece of wood with a penknife, his hands needing a task to quiet the nervous energy coursing through him. He listened to the murmur of voices from inside. He could not make out the words, but he could distinguish the tones. Trent's voice was a low, steady rumble of questions. Rose's voice was clear, calm, and unwavering. She was not just recounting events. She was explaining, clarifying, directing. She was not a victim telling a story. She was an architect laying out the blueprints of a crime. A profound sense of pride swelled in Arthur's chest, so potent it almost hurt. He had taught her letters and words, but this strength, this fire, this was hers alone. Inside, Rose had the ledger open on the desk, between her and the marshal. "You see here, Marshal," she said, her finger tracing a line of her father's elegant script. This entry dated May the 4th, 1886. Payment to J. Sterling County Land Office, $50 for expedited survey review. That was the week our property lines were officially contested. And here she turned a page, is the wire transfer confirmation my father acquired from the telegraph office. It matches the date and the amount. For over 2 hours she walked him through the labyrinth of Thorne's corruption. She was no longer the broken creature from the saloon stage. She was her father's daughter, armed with his meticulous records and her own hard-won intelligence. When she finally emerged from the office, the sun was high in the sky. She met Arthur's questioning gaze with a small, confident nod. The fight was truly over. In the weeks that followed, redemption, Gulch underwent a cleansing. Marshal Trent, using the ledger as his map, uprooted Thorne's network of corruption. The judge packed his bags and vanished overnight. Samuel Pike, implicated in Thorne's dealings, found his gilded cage saloon shuttered by federal order, and he soon followed the judge into obscurity. The town began to breathe again. People spoke to each other in the street, their conversations no longer laced with fear. The courts under the marshal's watchful eye moved swiftly. The Dunn Ranch, its title proven to be stolen through fraud and coercion, was legally restored to its sole surviving heir, Rose Dunn. Life at Whispering Creek settled into a new rhythm. The shared danger had forged a bond between them that was now tempered in the quiet routine of daily life. They worked together, mending the fences Thorne's men had cut, tending to the herd and expanding Maeve's old garden. The silence that had once been a wall of grief between them was now a comfortable space filled with easy companionship and the unspoken knowledge of all they had endured. One crisp autumn morning, they stood together on the porch, watching the sun burn the last of the mist from the valley floor. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and drying earth. "Marshal Trent says the paperwork is all finalized," Rose said, her gaze fixed on the distant line of hills that marked the border of her father's land. "The title is clear. I could sell it. He says there are buyers from back east looking for land, now that the territory is cleaning up." Arthur's hands, which had been resting on the porch rail, tightened. He tried to keep his voice even. It's good land. A person could build a new life there. The words felt like stones in his mouth. He was offering her an exit, an escape from him and the ghosts that resided at Whispering Creek. He had freed her, empowered her, and this was the logical conclusion: she would leave and start the life she was owed. Rose was quiet for a long moment. Then she turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "My father's ranch is a place of memories," she said softly. "I loved that land, but the last memories I have of it are of loss and pain. It's a place of endings, Arthur." She took a step closer. This place, she swept her hand out to encompass the house, the barn, the gentle slope of the pasture. "This is a place of beginnings. This is where I learned to read. This is where I learned to fight back. This is where I learned to live again. This is home." The relief that washed over Arthur was so immense he felt light-headed. The future he had been steeling himself against, a future of returning to his solitary grief, vanished in the warmth of her words. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a single worn silver dollar. It was the coin. She had asked Brody to retrieve it for her. She held it out on her palm. "I believe this is yours," she said, a gentle smile touching her lips. "I've been thinking about this coin. That night it was the price of my life, or what I thought was the end of it. But I was wrong. It wasn't a payment. It was an investment. I think you deserve a refund." Arthur looked at the tarnished silver glinting in the morning sun. He thought of the desperate woman on the stage, and the magnificent strong woman standing before him now. "No," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "That was the single best investment I ever made." He did not take the coin. Instead, he turned and went back inside the house. When he returned, he held a folded piece of paper. It was a legal document, freshly drawn, and signed by him in the presence of Marshal Trent. He handed it to her. Her brow furrowed in confusion as she unfolded it. Her eyes, now quick and practiced, scanned the legal text. They widened in disbelief. It was a deed signing over 1/2 of the Whispering Creek Ranch, the land, the structures, the cattle, the water rights, from the deep spring to one Rose Dunn. Not as a gift, but as a full and legal partner. This was the final and most profound, unthinkable act. He wasn't her protector or her benefactor. He was making her his equal in every sense of the word. "Arthur." She breathed, her voice a whisper. She looked from the paper to his face, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Why, you owe me nothing. You've already given me everything. Maeve used to say that some things can't be owned, they can only be shared." He began finding the words he had been rehearsing in his heart for weeks. She believed a book could be a key to unlock a mind. "You took that key, Rose, and you unlocked that ledger. You brought justice to this whole valley. But you did more than that. You unlocked this place." He looked around at the ranch, seeing it fresh through her eyes. "It was a tomb when you came here, a monument to all I had lost. You made it a home again. You brought it back to life. You brought me back to life. A partner deserves her share." He gently took her free hand. His touch was not the impersonal gesture of the man at the saloon, nor the cautious guidance of the teacher. It was sure, warm, and filled with the promise of a future he had never dared to dream of. "Let's build it together, Rose. As equals." Her tears finally fell, tracing paths of light on her cheeks. She looked down at the deed at her name, written beside his, a testament in ink and paper, to a bond forged in despair and tempered into love. She closed her hand around his, her grip as strong and sure as his own. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and full of joy. "Yes, let's." They stood there for a long time, on the porch, hand in hand, looking out at their shared land, their shared future. On the hill overlooking the ranch, 2 tall pines stood sentinel over the graves of a wife and a child. The wind that whispered through their branches no longer carried a sound of sorrow and loss. It was a new sound now, a gentle murmur of peace, of homecoming, and of a life once broken, made wonderfully and completely whole again. In the end, the story of Arthur Corrigan and Rose Dunn isn't about a transaction. It's about transformation. It proves that the most unthinkable act in a world full of cruelty is often one of radical kindness. Arthur didn't just save Rose from a life of misery. He gave her the tools to save herself, and in doing so, she saved him from the prison of his own grief. Their story reminds us that a person's worth is never determined by their circumstances, but by their capacity for resilience, courage, and compassion. It's a testament to the fact that even in the harshest of landscapes, the human heart can still find a way to grow. If this story moved you, please consider giving this video a like to help us share it with others. And for more true stories from the forgotten corners of history that explore the depths of the human spirit, make sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear them. Thank you for listening.